All right, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome to our session on school accountability, striving for ihsan. We have an expert panel here that I will briefly introduce, and we're going to talk today about what is accountability and what does it mean for us as Islamic schools. We have on the panel with us, starting with Brother Dylan Chown from SITE, University of Southern Australia, or Southern. Next to him we have Dr. soon to be Dr. Dylan and soon to be Dr. Asad, inshallah, both working on their PhDs. Asad Chowdhury from Canada, who is the president of the Islamic Schools Association of Canada and is an instructor at Niagara University. And next we have Brother Hatem Mahmoud, who is from
Egypt, but based in Saudi Arabia.
He is from Egypt and based in Saudi Arabia, and he's the head of Director of Education, Advanced Learning. I'm so sorry. I had memorized all this. And Brother Hatem is, Grace, we really appreciate him joining us here. We chased him down to come and join us, and we really want to hear his perspectives and his experience, a wealth, decades of experience, mashallah. And finally, our sister Sufia Azmat from GIS Board and the CISNA Executive Director. We're going to begin, inshallah, with just having each of them talk about what accountability means to them in their context, whether it's in the region they're in or in the field that they're in, and what that means. And we'll begin on the right with Sister Sufia.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. So, accountability and what it means. We've been talking for the last couple of days, and I think Professor Abdullah, in his conversation, which really was so enlightening, when he talked about accountability as well. Accountability to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost, right? As a Muslim. And Allah is going to hold us accountable to how we follow the guidelines that He has set for us, right? And who can hold us accountable? Allah is going to hold us accountable, and He asked that we hold ourselves accountable. But in this context, we're talking about holding schools accountable. Who holds schools accountable? Who should be holding schools accountable as an institution? So I don't want to get into it too much. That's all I'm going to say right now is that there's individual accountability, and then there's the accountability as a school. Who are you accountable to? Your parents, your community, and the students, right? So just those are just my thoughts on that. We'll pass it on.
Thanks. Assalamu alaikum, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I come from a slightly different context, and it's also a dual one. So basically, I belong also to an accreditation organization with the IB organization. So it is all scrutinized in terms of standardization, in terms of looking onto learning outcomes, which is the traditional way or form of accountability. One might say that this is kind of scrutinizing education in terms of specifically the learning outcomes. But of course, when we zoom out from this and see what accountability means in terms of muhasaba, so there will be the inner part of it as the results as well. And as a learning organization, we look at it in terms of three basic learning ecosystems. The learning of the systems of the schools, which needs to be holding all the adults in a school accountable to, and the learning of the professional adults in it, which is professional development, and what are the systems that we hold the teachers accountable to their own professional development. And last but not least, which is at the center of attention, the learning of the students themselves. So each part of these domains, how do we hold ourselves as adults accountable in schools, is really part of this context as well that we work on.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm going to actually speak to the Canadian context in terms of schooling. And I think we're going to really unpack accountability in many different ways in this panel. But to premise the discussion, I'm going to just think about schooling. My experience in schooling has largely been in Islamic schools, from a teacher to a vice principal to a former principal in Islamic schools. And so the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about accountability is we're actually accountable for every second of our life, right? Accountability actually doesn't have an ending until, as they say, death do its part, right? And so I think that's a way to think about accountability. And when we get into the school building, who's accountable? I think every aspect of the school community is accountable. So you have accountability on the students, you have accountability on the teachers, you have accountability on the school administration, you have accountability on the school boards that are governing the schools. You have accountability on the parents. Oftentimes the parents are the ones that believe there's no accountability on them, right? But I really feel that understanding accountability from a bird's eye view in which every individual is held accountable is important, right? Now, the next thing I'll say with regards to accountability, which is a little bit unfortunate, right? Unfortunately, when it comes to schools, especially Islamic schools, where in Canada, and I'm sure other people share this context, schools are run like businesses. Islamic schools are run like businesses, not necessarily by choice, but oftentimes by design, because they're independent private schools and some get no funding from the government. And so the money that's coming in is coming in through tuition. And so the unfortunate thing about that, and I think there's a lot of great things about that, but unfortunately, the priority of accountability is on pleasing parents, right? How good are we doing? That depends how parents see our school. Right? And so inshallah, within this discussion, we'll have a moment to unpack what real accountability should like, but I'm coming from a context in which there's a high priority of what parents think on top of anything else. Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm going to be talking about accountability in the Australian context, so the context of K-12 Islamic schooling. Our schools sit within the independent schooling sector. And I say this, and I say it carefully, because I don't want it to be misinterpreted as being haughty or being arrogant. But it would be fair to say that in Australia, Islamic schools, on certain measures, are really thriving. And I don't say that again, I'll stress again, to be haughty. If anything, our schools and our context are feeling an increased sense of amana because of the enabling context that we find ourselves in. One of them being funding, which is quite different to my dear brother, Dr. Inshallah Assad, where funding is an issue in North America. For us, almost 85% of our schools are government funded. And then we're the lowest fee-paying school. So therefore, if you were to look at certain measures, what are those measures? If you were to look at growth, we're the fastest growing school type in the independent schooling sector. Our physical structures are amazing, mashallah. Our resources are strong in many cases. So we're in a period of time where the growth is such that we have over 70 Islamic schools and growing, when you count multiple campuses. We have about 5,000 educators, over half that would be Muslim, and 60,000 Muslim learners. Now, we recently had a national conference on assessment, which I think is a synergised theme with what we're talking about here in many ways. And what I mentioned in one of our discussions, if you were to talk about accountability in the Australian context, we talk about it in terms of a dual Qibla dilemma. I'll say that again, a dual Qibla dilemma. So we have the external, which is pulling us towards the types of things that my dear colleagues have mentioned. And there is the mechanisms that do that, from high-stakes testing, national curricula, ranking, etc. Competition, comparison. And then there's the internal Qibla, which is our own deep-seated educational commitments to the very highest purpose and ultimately, as Dr. Sufyan mentioned, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're in this period of time where we're seeing outward thriving. We're seeing an edge of the field discussion emerge as our schools have reached over 40 years of age in Australia. So in the Islamic lexicon, that means we're no longer in our youth. As a field, we are full adults now, post-40. And now the discussion is along the lines of tajdeed. And not are our students performing, but to what degree have we fulfilled the purpose of our Islamic schools? And that is where the conversation, I think it's fair to say, is shifting in Australia. It's exciting and it's hopeful. And a lot of that has to do with, just in closing in the work, you may have seen Brother Abdullah Khan, who's with us in this conference. He's the chair of the ISA, the Islamic Schools Association Australia, Dr. Assad's equivalent in Australia. And inshallah, SITE, our centre, of which I'm a member, Professor Abdullah is the director, Associate Professor Nadeem, another member, and myself. Inshallah, we played an enabling role in amongst the ecosystem of Islamic schools.
Thank you for that context. As you can see, there are differences, but a lot of similarities in what we're dealing with in our Islamic school systems. We're going to begin now with some specific questions with Brother Hatem, who's going to respond to: most of our schools and institutions currently follow a particular model or framework for accountability. What are some benefits and lessons we can learn from the systems already in place? And what works and what needs to change?
Thanks for that. This is a loaded question. I doubt 5 minutes would give it justice, but I will try my best. And again, there are multiple accrediting bodies in terms of evaluation of schools, in terms of scrutinizing school processes, as my colleagues mentioned on the panel. But I would focus, for the sake of time, on the IB organization, where this was the bread and butter of my last 15 years in terms of evaluating schools and their processes. So basically, currently, and if we can put on the screen, the IB framework, second one, yep. So this is basically the framework upon which school evaluators act when they visit a school, and this is shared with all IB schools. And the first and foremost purpose of which is to create a holistic and coherent process to align the methodologies, the documentation of the school with the observation, what they are actually doing in their classrooms and in the corridors and in the hallways. And last but not least, the conversations that we have with the school staff, members of staff, whether leadership, middle management, or the school staff themselves. So basically, if you look at this framework, it starts with the purpose. And the purpose aligns the vision, mission, guiding principles, values of the school, which are basically, of course, always on the hallways and the corridors. The job and the role is to align, and this is part of accountability as well, and walk the talk. Basically, what is in the purpose, what is in the documentation, to what extent is it in the school practice itself. Then comes the environment. To what extent does the school creates an environment that is conducive towards applying these purposes in terms of physical resources, in terms of human resources, in terms of digital and technical resources, you name it. And of course, this touch base on teacher support, on student support, and whatnot. Not necessarily the school facilities by environment, any environment that is conducive to learning. Then comes the culture. And by the culture, we mean policies and procedures in place that create this culture of the school in terms of positive behavior between colleagues themselves and positive behavior in the classroom as well in terms of classroom management and whatnot. So to what extent are the policies being reviewed on a proper review cycle, and to what extent do they or are they interpreted in the actual day-to-day practices, and are they lived in in the processes of the school. And last but not least is the learning. It's in the middle, it's in the heart. So if all of these responsibilities we hold the school accountable to as adults, then the learning by default will take place if, of course, everyone is well qualified to understand how learning takes place in terms of lifelong learning, in terms of whatever the procedures and the philosophy of learning that is being done in the school. Of course, the IB will adopt the IB philosophy in terms of inquiry, research, and conceptual learning. But we should not forget the context. So the circle itself is the school context. Each and every school will be different. Each and every school has to honor its own culture, to honor its own practices, to honor the expectations of the parents, but not just to follow the expectations or please the parents as per se. The second part of the question would be what to change. I believe, because my perspective is basically on the implementing all of this in Muslim majority countries. But then when you move to the other perspective of Muslim minority countries, so maybe the IB philosophy would then be replaced by the Muslim philosophy or the Islamic philosophy. So, yeah.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you. That was very concisely stated. Next, we will have Sister Sufia, who will talk about, while we recognize that Islamic schools have often borrowed from secular models of accountability, what specific practices within those models are beneficial and worth adapting as we move towards building a truly Islamic framework?
So before getting to the specifics of that, what I would like to do is give you a brief, just a little bit of a background on CISNA standards, or CISNA as an accrediting organization. CISNA began with being an add-on accreditation to one of the largest international accrediting agencies in the world. It was at that time called Advanced Ed, is now called Cognia. And schools who wanted to, Islamic schools who wanted to become accredited, became accredited with one of these organizations, Cognia, Middle States, if you're familiar, and I know they're in the Middle East and Latin America and so forth as well, in the Gulf countries. But eventually, CISNA, the Council of Islamic Schools North America, we developed our standards and aligned them with the standards of two major international agencies, Middle States as well as Cognia. But we look at everything through an Islamic framework. And we achieved trusted partnership with both of those agencies. So if a school wants to become accredited, they can go through our standards, follow our procedures, have a team from CISNA visit their school for the review visit, and they will, if we grant accreditation, then they can get duly accredited with either Cognia or Middle States, which is a big thing. Now, we have worked on improving our accreditation standards throughout these last, we first became an accrediting agency in 2012. So our standards are not, they're guardrails, they're not prescriptive, and they're aligned to mission. And because accreditation is voluntary as a private school in many countries, maybe not all, you have to look at, okay, if a school has to decide on their own, they're not obligated to become accredited. So when we go in as an accrediting body, we're not going in as evaluators and assessors and a team who's going to look and score you and so on. So we look at how you are meeting your own mission, the standards you've set for yourself in a sense. But our standards, there are 4 of them in 4 domains. One is governance, the second is school administration, the third is teaching and learning, and the fourth is school culture and environment. So we want to see how you yourselves are holding yourselves accountable, but how do we, self-perception is different, right? So you get a peer review team to your school, and we hold up that mirror, right? A Muslim is a mirror to his brother, something along those lines. I'm not the best at, reciting hadith and so on, but that's what we do. And what we do in terms of taking learning from secular, let's say, agencies, we take what they've developed as a secular model, but as Professor Abdullah was talking about, what we're going to do is re-anchor the tools, re-anchor the tool of accreditation as a means of holding ourselves accountable by using concepts such as ihsan, such as shura, such as adal, such as nasiha. So when we talk about teaching and learning and school administration, how do you provide professional development and spiritual development for your teachers? Is it done by, scales and numbers and you got this percent and so you get this kind of a raise? How is it done? Are you visiting your teacher's classroom as administrator and then giving nasiha, giving them guidance? Or are you going in there with a checklist and you passed this and you passed that and you didn't do this? As a governing body, how are you making decisions? Is it based on shura? So Islamic tools are used. Islamic tools are used for accreditation as a means to hold schools accountable. And I think it is necessary for us to do that, because without a means of accountability to a school, like we said, there's individual accountability. We ourselves are accountable to Allah. But as a school, who are they accountable to? If we can get an accrediting body that's not prescriptive, that's not compliance-based, but growth and improvement-based, I think that is a service to our communities. And that's what I'm looking at. We're using the secular framework that's out there and re-anchoring it in an with Islamic tools.
We've heard from Brother Hatem and Sister Sufi about some models that are already in place and have done well. There is benefit in these models. So what we're talking about is, and Professor Abdullah said this, I think we've said this throughout, is we're not going to throw out, it's a saying, the baby with the bathwater. That's an English saying. We're not, when we're trying to transform what we're doing, it's a process. So we're going to do these things bit by bit. We're going to keep some of what we have, change a little bit, renew a little bit. And so what we've heard about is this IB model is very popular and very successful and used in many of our contexts around the world in Islamic schools. The accrediting, CISNA is the only Islamic accrediting body to date. And right now we're talking about, now we have these models, so what's next? How do we go to tajdeed? So Brother Asad is going to talk about accountability often focuses on outcomes. If we are to think about tajdeed in the area of accountability, is being result-oriented the right way to think? What would it look like to instead focus on intentions and processes as measures of accountability to Allah first, and then our school communities second?
No, Jazakallah khairan. I think this question, there's a couple of ways to look at this question. So the way I read this question is, if I'm being held accountable for something, people are probably going to be focused on the results that I provide, right? That I come up with. So you're going to hold me accountable for the results that you see. And those results could be good, they could be bad, they could be in the middle, whatever the case is. So it seems like this question is saying, how do we now actually focus on the intention? So if you look at me as an individual, can you focus on my intention? And can you focus on the process that I'm using in this moment, in this situation? But I actually want to start this question by actually looking at it a little bit differently. Just in this room, if I'm allowed to do this, in this room, who has held someone else accountable for something? Anything? Show of hands. Have you held someone else accountable? Right? That's even people on the stage here. We probably have. If we have children, we probably have. If we have siblings, we probably have. Students in school settings and stuff like that. Let me ask you this now, rhetorically. What was your intention in holding them accountable? Because I think there's a layer. Now, let's be very real. You know, before we talk about, okay, let's try to implement the rooting of our intention and the rooting of how we see and exercise accountability rooted in Islam, let's be very real. There are different ways to hold people accountable depending on our intention. So if my intention is to actually get rid of a teacher or something like that, if I have a teacher that's not doing their job properly, that is, et cetera, and now I'm going to hold them accountable through a teacher appraisal process, an evaluation. I know that they're weak. I may have a very, very different intention in what I'm about to do. Whereas if I am praising a teacher, I want to give them a promotion. Now my intention is much different, and actions are but by intention, right? So I think that's the very first thing to note, because when we look at school rankings, when we look at accreditation models and systems out there, it is extremely important to actually be mindful of the intention of these accountability structures, right? And I really like how Sister Sophia put it, that there are structures out there that what we need to do is ensure that our intention is rooted in Islam. And that's why we are adopting some of these very notable and working structures. Not the other way around. Not putting Islam to the side and taking structures that people think are great. You know, there was a school, subhanAllah, in Canada, in Ontario, and Ontario is very big on ranking schools. They have standardized tests for grade 3s. I mean, the grade 3s are still in their early years, right? We should actually be playing with grade 3-year-olds. Play-based learning, I think, is very short-lived without any good reason. You know, in Canada, they use play-based learning, PBL, for age 4 and 5. And now suddenly when you're grade 6, you have to decompartmentalize 7 subjects and think about English differently than math. That's not how kids are wired, right? So they have a standardized test where children get sick on the day because they're so stressed out, right? And subhanAllah, unfortunately, I'm not making this up. I've seen that as a principle, right? Where you have children with fever, and they're coming to school with fever. And why are they with fever? Because they haven't slept well for the last 2 days. Because their parents, our teachers, are teaching to the test. You got to do better. You got to do better. Why? What's the intention? The ranking of the school. So there was a school in Windsor, Ontario, that ranked #1 in all of the entire province. This is thousands of schools, right? They were #1. The following year, now get this, the following year, they actually decided not to participate in standardized testing, only to fix the process of how they ranked #1. Like, we're not going to teach to the test. We're not going to put all this ultimate pressure on children. Instead, we're going to judge and look at accountability very differently. You know what happened to that school? No standardized tests for the next 3 years. What happened was they changed their pedagogical approach. They did more student-centered learning. They did more hands-on learning. They weren't concerned with, you got to get this right, this right, this right, through drilling and practice and all that kind of stuff. You know what happened to that school? They adopted, I don't know if you've heard of the 5D thinking model, the science, integrating Islam into science. They have a booth out there. This is a great plug, right? They have a booth to my right. Go check them out. Phenomenal program. They implemented the 5D thinking model, and they actually had a 5D thinking in-school science fair. I was one of the judges. There were 4 judges, and we went from station to, you guys know science fairs, right? This is really famous stuff. We've all judged them at some point. Station to station. We get to a grade 5 student. How old is grade 5?
9, 10.
9, 10, 11, right? In Canada, 10. They just hit double. Now they think they're cooler than you. That's how I know their age, right? They just hit 10. We go to a grade 5 student, and he's explaining his science fair. And you know what I'm counting? You know, we have clipboards as if we're like actually writing things down, right? I'm counting the number of times that this 10-year-old is saying subhanallah. Honestly. He's actually showing the study of the brain of a porcupine, right? Or sorry, not a porcupine, a woodpecker. Because ultimately he was reconstructing the bike helmet, right? Saying that the bike helmet is designed using a human skull, but the humans actually never bang their head to anything. Our skull, our heads are the most sensitive parts of our body. You hit your head even lightly, it's a potential concussion. So he's like, why don't we design the bike helmet based on a woodpecker who's always pecking wood? So let's see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the skull of a woodpecker and use that to make a bike helmet. We will have less head injuries. It was absolutely phenomenal. And so my tally of subhanAllahs, and I remember this. This was 2 years ago. I remember this. You know how many times this kid said subhanAllah in a 15-minute presentation? 27. Almost doubled the minutes to subhanAllah. That's how he won in my books. The intention was the recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is, by the way, a very feel-good story, and I'm just going to tell it till the end before we go on to that student won the science fair in the school, went to citywide, won citywide, but you know how he won the citywide? His science teacher told him that you recognized Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you were doing it in the school. You now say, instead of subhanallah, you say glory be to God when you're in the city and the citywide science fair and you're explaining it to perhaps the non-Muslim judges. You say glory be to God. In other words, the accountability was not the number on the paper. It wasn't the standardized test that this grade 5 student needed to pass. It was his recognition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator and him having ihsan in what he did. And that's how we switch. Muslims are not result-oriented. We are not result-oriented. We are niyyah and ikhlas-oriented. And until we fix that mindset, we're not even going to get accountability right. Because the results are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are nurturing the minds of our future generation. Our ummah, what we saw in yesterday's gala here, and our young people that made us cry, right? That was a result of us nurturing this ummah, right? So we got to get accountability right, and that's how I would answer that into shifting into a more niyyah-based accountability.
Jazakallah khair for that beautiful story and reminder. SubhanAllah, we so underestimate intention. Innal a'malu binniyat. That's the foundation of our deen, and that was a beautiful reminder, an example. Jazakallah khair. Next, we're going to turn to Brother Dylan. If secular models offer evidence-based best practices, is adaptation truly sufficient? Or must we first ask whether their underlying assumptions align with our educational purpose and worldview?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dr. Layla mentioned we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I want to begin by saying I love the baby. All right? I'm not going to hurt the baby. But I'm going to respectfully disagree. What I mean by that is, our theme here is tajdeed. And what separates this theme at this conference is that it isn't just the now theme. This year it's tajdeed and next year it's something else. Tajdeed, as we've heard from so many people so profoundly, insightfully, is ongoing for every Muslim at a personal and individual level that's been discussed, as it will be for our schools. And I promised, they asked me to be, gentle and sensitive, and I tried for 3/4 of the session, and I apologise in advance because I'm going to be disruptive. I don't believe that it is a secular starting point. I fundamentally do not believe that accreditation processes should be synonymous or used interchangeably with accountability for schools. In fact, everything that I've heard so insightfully from all of my colleagues, I would argue are examples of them drawing outside the lines of accreditation, which to me, I'm just convinced further by them that accreditation is a false promise. Now let me just qualify, and a few things. Number one, and I'll start gently. What do you call a pig dressed in sheepskin? A pig. Still a pig? Still a pig. So that was my gentle approach.
Wow.
Okay. Now what I mean, let me actually be really gentle. Not suggesting that we will not engage in accreditation processes. In fact, it's mandatory in many contexts. And I want to note that the way that it's been explained by my colleagues is with the full depth of knowledge of its limitations. And each of them have described ways of localising, shifting, intentionality that filters it. But I want to, not because I'm disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing, it's an aspirational charge for myself which I'm actively involved in as our centre, and for the field. Professor Abdullah said on day one around Tajdeed, it's about renewing our faith in our faith. At what point do we not believe that we have the rigour, that we have the strength, not to Islamicise something that's already there, not to adapt or to add in or to sprinkle or to refine, but to reconceptualise, to reframe. Now, accountability, which is often interchangeably used with accreditation, accreditation is a mechanism of remote control. We heard on day one the diagnosis of mass schooling from Professor Muhammad Abdullah. The diagnosis of mass schooling. What was the intent? To discipline, to create nation states, to create compliant citizens, etc., etc. Well, one of the mechanisms of control are the accreditation processes. And we are inheriting processes that have a distinct telos, a distinct purpose, distinct logics, distinct grammar, and therefore I fundamentally don't believe that it is the way forward for Tajdeed. Again, we will need to, at some level, engage in such processes, but it's knowing their place. And I see them as the lowest bar. The lowest bar. And let me explain. Are we aware of the critiques? We use things uncritically. Standards, we're all infatuated, not us, but the contemporary era of education are infatuated with data. The data is in on standards, standardisation and outcomes. The data's in. There is no evidence anywhere in the world that can support that a standards-driven approach or standardisation improves learning. Zero. All data tracking global schools, not just Islamic schools, not just schools in Australia, globally. On all metrics, contemporary schools are tracking backwards. Backwards on wellbeing, backwards on equity, backwards on student results, backwards on student engagement. Yet we have confidence in frames that are fundamentally not working. And I really challenge, and I hope I've done so respectfully. What I'm arguing is that we need to decolonise, de-link, and have that certainty in the paradigm of Tajdeed. Again, Tajdeed is not just the theme of a conference. It is a paradigm that centres the Islamic worldview that can actually do what my three colleagues are doing in real time, which is mediating their context. But what if, as a global field, we went that step further to actually ground, to actually reconceptualise? Biesta we can't disrespect scholars that have studied the globalisation of schooling, none of them Muslim scholars, but giants in education. Stephen Ball described standards as technologies of governance. Connell describes standards as colonising frames that cause epistemic violence for minority school communities. Biesta said that it reduces the purpose of education to what can be measured. And we are talking about a faith that is immeasurable, insurmountable, and not all that matters is visible.
That's true.
Does that not tell us that the logics are different, the grammar is different? So, again, tracking back to the commonality of what I share with our colleagues, if we see accountability as having a vertical dimension, primarily, which is fundamentally our accountability to Allah, everything that we're involved in collectively as educators, same with our learners, same with the parents, because we're all accountable, ultimately, to use the language of assessment, are formative acts towards a final summative encounter with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the key, I think, the intentionality. But for Tajdeed, I think it goes beyond borrowing inherited frames. It causes us to reconceptualise, to reground. It must be anchored in purpose. We've discussed that. And it must go beyond tokenistic or cosmetic tweaks, integrating borrowed frames. I would argue that, and I had this experience myself, and I came into Islam and people asked me, what did you do? The first thing I did is I made hijrah, which means I physically moved from where I was to a new place close to a masjid because I knew I was leaving one frame and entering another. My invitation, my call, and that of our centres is that this requires a hijrah, a migration of meaning towards conviction over compliance. And I hope that I haven't missed the reality that I know that we will continue to engage in certain processes, but it's our choice where we elevate them or whether we minimise them, as has been discussed.
Thank you, Brother Dylan. The mind shift here. And I think when I said don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, for me, my analogy was that it's not a one, like it's one action, like we're going to do this at one time, that it's a process and it's gradual and it takes time because the shifts are slow and there are many layers to that shift. So,
Dr. Lather, can I just respond just in 5 seconds? That's where I think difference is really positive for us and diversity. There's not one way. And if I came across saying that, then I want to clarify that. No. So one way is to say we are where we are now, in borrowed frames, and we're going to, I guess, work within to repair, to heal, to
We're going to start
prune.
To walk out of that frame.
Exactly. And I don't discount that. And I think context counts. If I was a school principal in a certain context, I would need to meet my community where they are. But if I can say in my own context, there's someone that has the luxury of calling to something else,
yes.
I think there's another way, which is to invest not 40 years wandering in the desert on that path, but to actually invest from now, with all of the experience that we've had previous, in the second project, which is to actually begin from the ground up. With all of the expertise and all of the talent,
all right.
I think that's a second approach. And there probably is 10 other approaches.
We're going to hear from our other panelists, maybe to respond to that perspective.
And I had a conversation with Dylan about this earlier. So I think what's important is to make sure we're all speaking the same language. Words mean different things. You've heard that before. You heard it yesterday. You heard it the day before. Standards and accreditation may mean different things to different people within even the same country, right? So we have to be mindful of that. And I believe firmly that we must hold schools accountable and that accreditation is one instrument, is a means to hold schools accountable. And I just want to read to you we have, as I said, 4 domains in our standards. In the first one, which is governance, the first domain says effective governance rooted in Islamic values, principles, and practices to ensure a mission and vision that aligns with the school's Islamic ethos. The governing body upholds Islamic values and ensures they're embedded in its mission and vision. And another indicator is that a system for self-accountability is in place to evaluate governing body performance. Now tell me that that's not a good thing to uphold. No, that's a rhetorical question. Rhetorical question only. You have no time.
I wasn't really asking you to respond.
I'm not really asking you to respond. I just want to put that out there.
All right.
So, and I know that we want to hear from the audience as well, so I will stop at that.
I think Brother Hatem also wanted to respond.
I just, for the sake of time as well, I really truly agree with almost 70, 80% of your notions, Brother Dylan. And I honestly also see a gap that we need to bridge between theory and practice. And this is not just with this discussion now, it's also in terms of aligning what is actually being done and where we want it to happen. And this is how we execute the strategy. It is one thing to have a utopic dream that where we need to be, and the most perfect this image would be, the more difficult the journey would be to reach it. For example, speaking about the conceptual regard, we all know in management, for example, the father of modern management, Peter Drucker, says you can't manage what you can't measure. But as Muslims, we actually, and you just said it now, that not everything that counts can be counted. And we're speaking about accountability. So it is in this compass, redirecting our direction first, so we all agree where we want to be. It is just that there are maybe multiple ways to go there.
Thank you for that. I think it's really important to keep in mind that we all are at different points in our journey, whether it's on tajdeed of curriculum, teacher development, accountability, whether it's in our own personal, professional careers or as schools. And so we need to respect that space and own that space. We're all in different places, and our journey will take different time and space and routes to get there. I think it's really important to also respect each other's differences of opinion, so the floor is open for all. Is there anyone else who would like to add to that? Because I would like to open the floor for questions and some dialogue with the audience.
I just want to add a comment about the logics. We said we must hold ourselves accountable. And, you know, I write teacher training models and policies, and we try to, I've only recently sort of entered academia in the last 10 years. And academics, I don't know if you've noticed, they speak differently, they write differently. But practitioners, we like practitioner language. And I've always disliked, as when I was a practitioner, when I read must, you know, it's like the Ten Commandments, the teacher must. And that in itself goes back to the logics of the systems. Imagine being in a school that was driven by higher purpose, the highest purpose. Imagine if we lived and breathed the lessons from Hadith Jibreel, where we served as if we could see Allah, or at least that knowing that He's watching us. And imagine if we didn't impose inherited logics that say that we must have these strict accountability measures, because without them we would have problems. That there must be surveillance on teachers, surveillance on learners, benchmarks. I don't think that's the only way. That every principal and every board has to manage risk, and there is a bottom line. Just in our faith has a bottom line. Our faith calls us to certain things, but the actual outer limits, the HUD punishments, if you like, are few, and they're there as a deterrent. They're not the lead strategy. So I'll just say that, as Dr. Sophia said, every context will have a different reading of what accountability means. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have something imposed on us that's suggesting that without that we wouldn't realise the aspiration. There are other ways to go about that aspiration, including increasing the level of trust in a community, empowering leaders and educators and parents. There are other ways and means to go about it. Again, we have to filter the logics that come with the systems that we choose to privilege.
Thank you, Brother Dylan. We're going to open the floor for questions. We have the two mics. Please go to one of the mics and frame your questions. We'll start with Dr. Seema. We hear you.
So my question, I'll say after I tell you that I'm a teacher educator, I've been for 30 years, also former principal. So you hear a lot about the affective domain. And I'm going to measure Islamic schools by how attached the heart
Is
to their Islam, of their prayers. A deep understanding of their deen. Did anybody want to address that? It's a curious question.
we didn't. What was the question again?
Yeah, so I said because I didn't hear anything about the affective domain. I heard about assessment and accountability, but being a teacher educator, I'm wondering, I visited the schools in Finland, and I saw clearly that the schools in Finland have children walking around with deep respect from the teacher and to the teacher, and love for what they're learning. And that's one of the things we often talk about in Islamic schools. So my question was, are we going to measure the affective domain? Or just stick to the cognitive and the academic piece?
Thanks for this. If I may start just reflecting on this, because it was one of the questions that we were, I think because of time, we didn't cover. It was basically how to measure the spiritual and moral accountability, and not just the cognitive ones. I would speak from my perspective, because I don't think that I'm in the best place to speak about the Islamic schooling in terms of the minority Muslims. But basically, again, what the accrediting body that I belong to, which is the IB, is focused on terms of calling this the metacognitive skills, those being collaboration, communication, thinking skills, and social and emotional learning. It really goes down to the self-evaluation processes. So each and every student is held accountable in a way that they can reflect on what is it that in their thinking process has changed, what is it in their social and emotional connection has changed, and what is it in their attitudes towards learning and coming to school every day has changed, depending on the other systems that are in place to measure the learning outcomes. So the school is held accountable as adults for the measuring the cognitive, but the students themselves, in a way, are held accountable to reflect and self-evaluate their feelings and their emotions toward the school. So this is basically how the shift between the cognitive and the metacognitive when it comes to the IB practices.
And just to add to that, first of all, mashallah, Dr. Seema, you really nailed it. And I knew you would when you're walking to the mic, alhamdulillah. You know, Larry Thompson has a very nice book called Give 'em Five, Transferring Responsibility. And what that entire book is that oftentimes as adults, we carry the burden of too much responsibility of children. And essentially what that means is, when it comes to accountability, part of our skill set should be to know how to transfer the responsibility of children, of accountability onto children. And I think the spiritual and moral domain is of that sort. Because let's say, and we've probably all heard this, I know I've heard this time and time again, where you have people saying, what's wrong with you? You call this an Islamic school, but I see kids doing this and this and this and this. But they're not sure who to blame. All they know is they want to blame. And so what's wrong with you comes out of their mouth. But if kids can actually embrace the responsibility of our spiritual domain, then I think we've succeeded. And so, subhanAllah, I reference that book because it's very well articulated of we are giving children tools. And we are not forcing, just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, La ikraha fid din. We are not forcing down any type of spiritual practice down the throats of children. We are giving them the tools to recognize, to appreciate, and ultimately to love and acknowledge our return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
And I'd just like to add the fourth domain in the SISNA standards, the school culture and environment. And some of the indicators, some of what we look for in terms of school culture is a supportive and inclusive school culture. Now, we don't give specifics like you must have this, you must have this, but the framework is there. So a supportive and inclusive school culture where students receive support from adults and peers, where the school engages with parents as well to partner and enhance their child's experiences. So it does cover, as I said again, it's a framework, and there are some indicators, but the whole idea of having a team go out to the school to observe. I know that when I go into a school, just walking the hallways, I can tell. Students are happy, they're smiling, they're giving salams, they look you in the eye. Those are just,
But that's the point I want us to make, is that's not measurable.
Exactly, it's
Who's
not so
smiling?
measurable.
That's the point. The sister here asked you to, Brother Asad, and thank you very much, all of you, for your answers. Could you repeat the title of the book?
Yeah, it's called Give M5. Give them EM. Give them five. Transfer the responsibility.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. We're going to take a question from the brothers.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. It's a comment suggestion because previously we were doing question and comment. So because we have leaders of national associations here from the US, Canada, and I believe someone mentioned Australia as well, When we talk about standards and accountability and what have you in that regards, I think it'd be great to see standards as it relates to code of conduct within our Islamic institutions. We hear horror stories in our institutions, especially in the Western world, of conduct being misappropriate between students, teachers, and what have you. So I think if you guys speak about standards of governance, culture, learning outcomes, data-driven metrics, and what have you, it'd be great to see associations that you lead yourselves pushing standards as it relates to code of conduct within our schools and educational institutions. That was number one. Number two, for Brother Dylan, I hear your approach, and I see it as something revolutionary that you would like to see come about. And not everything is achievable in our lifetime, but if you believe in what you say, and it resonates with me as well, coming up with a body which is rooted in our pristine divine tradition, I think this would be a great effort to initiate, and maybe our coming generations can take this upon. But if you can be seated at the center you work at with Professor Abdullah or other centers like Dr. Farha, I believe, and Dr. Nadeem are associated with, why can we not have an international IB type standard that is applied to nations across the entire world, right? So maybe we should have an Islamic standard of accreditation that is more consistent with what we believe in our tradition, rooted in that, not just complementing. We do WASC accreditation on the West Coast, and we go through it every 3 years, 6 years. Yeah. We've done it for our school, our seminary, where we're going through many things, and it would be great to see something come about internationally, something that can be initiated by GAIS, and perhaps if you pitch this to the Islamic Development Bank, it could also be a grant that could be funded for future development. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. We have two questions there. We'll start with code of conduct, accountability. That was just a comment.
Go ahead.
And then, go ahead, Brother Dylan. Go. Sorry, but I just want to make sure we're clear. We need to think about, there should be standards for code of conduct, and then the other is maybe we need global standards ourselves, our own framework that we start to build ourselves. Is it time? Brother Dylan, you have 10 seconds.
10 seconds. Jazakallah khair for your encouragement. As you said, I've always, and it gives me hope every day. Every day we wake up, we renew our intentions in this effort. Professor Abdullah reminded us in the gala dinner, this is not for name and fame, this is not for glory, it's not for the free car park or the free laptop that we get as educators. It's not for any of those things, it's for Allah. And I fundamentally believe that a people will come after us that are better prepared, that will take Allah will preserve what is good from what we did, and that will be the stepping stones to something else. 2 caveats. I do think we can be braver. We've witnessed in our lifetime an IB model start from scratch. We've witnessed so many other. Why do we fail to feel that we are not capable as a global ummah when we've spent 3 days in a room of 350 of the most talented movers and shakers in our field globally? Do we doubt that we don't have the... So I do think, whilst Allah is the opener, and you're quite right, it could be beyond our lifetime, but we must take that step. Second, last point in my last 3 seconds, I make dua, solid and sincere dua, and only Allah accept if it's good for us in dunya and akhirah, that we never come together as a global community to create standards for the global field. I pray we never fall into that rabbit hole, because that's the antithesis. And I'm not disrespectful, because I believe it will happen, because I believe the majority of people feel that that is the way forward. In a mashura, your job is simply to put the opinion there, and the emir goes with it. And the opinion that's not taken, there's still khair in that opinion. So in that intention, I want to say that I feel that if we went down the approach of trying to a standards-driven approach and the conduct of teachers, and we have global standards of this and this and this, I fear that would take us on a 40-year journey into the desert.
Yes.
And I pray that we look at the other approaches that are in the field, or at least make sure that that's not a predatory approach. So if people do go on that approach, it doesn't cancel out the other good approaches. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, I think keeping in mind, Islam it's not prescriptive. The flexibility within our deen is one of the miracles, the flexibility. It's incredible when you just think about it. So this concept of standards, and we all fall into this, standards is it becomes a checklist. Whether we like it or not, that's the default we go back to. It becomes a checklist. Did I do this? Did I do this? Did I do this? And I think the point of this panel was to start the conversation, to spark the conversation, and to move us in that direction. We still have a lot of work to do. I do want to give Brother Abdullah, because he's been standing so patiently, a chance to either ask a question or make a comment before we move on.
I think it's something to think about. If educational law was codified, it would be rehabilitative. Law it's aimed at retribution. When I look at how assessments of schools are done, is it retributive or is it rehabilitative? If it is a combination of the two, where's the balance? Because currently, the way things are, it comes across more as retribution, retributive. And we need to focus it on rehabilitation, because that is what the world needs. It's something to think about. It's something to put our minds to, as Dylan said, and that is what our task is. Jazakallah khair.
Wa iyyakum. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah reward you, our panel, for sharing your thoughts, and Jazakumullah khair for sharing in our dialogue. Inshallah. May Allah guide us to what is best for our ummah, unite our hearts, purify our intentions, and make us the best of the ummah, inshallah. All right. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khair.